Hello students, Mr. Young here, and today we're talking about essentially the writing of the Constitution. Let's get to it. The aforementioned economic problems hit farmers pretty hard. We've got the inflation, we've got the lack of trade, we've got this depression. Basically, the farmers couldn't sell enough of their crops to make money to pay their debts or their taxes. And when farmers can't pay, the banks would seize their farms. Feeling somewhat oppressed, and having just finished their fight for freedom from oppressions, some farmers did not take this lying down. They did not take it lightly. In 1786, a revolt of angry farmers began. It was led by former Revolutionary War captain Daniel Shays. Shays and his men forced banks to close. With banks closed, they could not seize farms after all. The movement grew to 1,200 strong, and they actually tried to march on a local arsenal in Springfield to take the weapons. The state militia basically stopped them at the arsenal. They tried to get the angry farmers to stop. They fired warning shots over their head, but the farmers kept coming, and the militia ended up killing 4 farmers, and then all the farmers ran away, and Shays' rebellion was over. But it was a big problem that you were having armed revolt within the colonies with those weak Articles of Confederation. In fact, this incident convinced George Washington that we needed a new government. But moving on the topic of slavery, many states, particularly in the North, had already been taking steps to discourage slavery. Although not illegal to own slaves anywhere, 11 of the 13 states had laws taxing or downright prohibiting the importation of slaves. In the North, slaves were not a major source of labor. In the South, however, slave labor was critical. As the new government formed, slavery would become a major issue separating the northern and southern states. In Virginia, they made a law that encouraged manumission, or the voluntary release of one's slaves, and this somewhat significantly increased the freedmen population of Virginia. Let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. Some leaders had had enough of all these problems, particularly Shays' Rebellion was a big sign that the Articles of Confederation were too weak. In September of 1786, Alexander Hamilton called for a convention in Philadelphia to address the country's mounting issues. What ended up happening was not a revision of the Articles, but a whole new document. The meetings were private, so delegates could say what they wanted without holding back. There ended up being some disagreements. 2 major plans were put forth to revise the Articles. Take a gander at the graphic to see the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. So you see here the New Jersey plan. Well, the Virginia plan came first. It called for a 2-house legislature, which is called bicameral. Representation in Congress was to be based on population. This was supported by the larger states because the larger states had more population. So if representation was proportional, that means that the larger states would have more power in Congress. Of course, the little states didn't like this. They liked how it had been under the Articles, where everyone had equal representation. So they put forth their own plan called the New Jersey plan. It had a 1-house legislature, which is called unicameral, and it would be equal representation in Congress. This was, of course, supported by the smaller states who feared losing power to the federal government. So in a nutshell, both plans called for 3 branches of government: a legislature, a court, and an executive branch. The Virginia plan called for, 2 houses, like we said, proportional representation, and it was favored by large states because they would have more power. The small states preferred equal representation and supported their plan, the New Jersey plan. For the finer details of these plans, you can actually click this website. This is supplemental. I'm not going to quiz you on this. But you have this nice graphic here. There it says what we were talking about already. But there's a little more detail here. For example, the Virginia plan had a single executive, basically a president, chosen by the legislative branch. So they're not elected. And they were limited to 1 term only. They could veto legislative acts, be removed by Congress. And judges in their new court system would be chosen by the legislative branch. Whereas in the New Jersey plan, like we said, unicameral legislation, it would be equal for everyone, but there was a plural executive, meaning multiple people would be chosen to run the executive branch, like multiple presidents, and they didn't have any veto power. Removal by states, and the judges would be appointed by life by the executive or president. Some interesting little nuggets. All right, moving on. While arguing over proportional representation or equal representation, the delegates decided the Articles of Confederation were junk and they would start fresh with a whole new government. That argument between the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan ended up being settled by Roger Sherman of Connecticut with what would be called the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise because he was from Connecticut. You can see in the graphic above that both sides would lose a little of what they wanted to make a deal. So everybody gets a little bit of what they wanted. We ended up with a bicameral legislature with equal representation in the upper house, it's called the Senate, and representation in the lower house, the House of Representatives, would be proportional to population. That's why we have the House of Representatives and Senate today. In the Senate, everyone has 2 senators, no matter what size your population is, whereas in the House, it is proportional. So if you have more people in your state, you get more representation. And that's how that happened. This leads us to what I call a shady compromise. So you had big states and little states arguing about how to decide who gets how many legislators, but the North and the South were also rivals in this. In that, in the South they had a significant population of slaves. So do they count towards population? If they did, the South would get a lot more representation in the House of Representatives. But they would also be taxed more because the population was also initially used to levy taxes on the states. So the South wanted more. They wanted slaves to count because they get more power, but they didn't want them to be too high because then they get taxed more. What they ended up coming up with is called the 3/5 compromise. Basically, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person, and that sort of balanced out the equation of power and taxes. The North didn't want slaves to count at all because they weren't really citizens, but the South did, of course, so that they would have more power. So they ended up with this 3/5 compromise. They also came to an agreement that no one would try to talk about banning slavery or anything like that, or the slave trade. Wouldn't bring it up again in Congress until 1808. Finishing up, some of the state constitutions had what was called Bill of Rights, and they would outline very clearly the rights of individual people within the state. George Mason of Virginia thought that this new federal constitution should have a Bill of Rights too. A majority of delegates, however, disagreed. They thought that the powers of the government were clearly stated, so their limitations were clearly stated, so we didn't need to say what the citizens had rights to do. The delegates gathered to sign their new constitution on September 17th, 1787. Only 3 delegates would not sign. 2 of them wanted a Bill of Rights added, so they wouldn't sign, and the other one was the guy who proposed the Virginia plan, and he thought this new compromise was just too far off from his personal beliefs, so he didn't sign it. The delegates also decided that instead of needing 13 of 13 states to approve, like the Articles of Confederation stated, they would only need 9 of the 13 states to approve. And that's pretty much our lesson for today. We're going to start talking about states ratifying the Constitution. I know this is a lot of information, but it's important because this is still our government today. What happened hundreds of years ago in the 1780s is still our government today, so it's important for you to know that. And it does serve as an example about compromise. So you have what you think 2 unbending sides. You can make agreements where everyone loses a little so everyone can gain a little. Compromise. It can happen. It can work. So that's it for today. Go ahead and move on to your assignment for the day. If you need any help, please let me know. There's a lot of information, and as a result, the assignment might be a little harder than maybe you're used to, but we'll see. You're a smart bunch of kids. I'm sure you can handle it. All right, if you need help, let me know.